Welcome everybody to this panel. Appreciate you joining us. I'm Mike Dosenbach. I'm the Vice President of Cloud and Connectivity at Mercedes-Benz Research and Development North America. It's a mouthful, but there it is. So I'm here just really to fire off a couple of questions to the experts that we have on the panel, who I will have briefly introduce themselves. So should we start with Oliver?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm a sort of a serial entrepreneur, have a technical background, and am currently chief solution architect at the third startup that I helped do, and it's called HighSpot.
Thank you. Oliver. William?
Hello, my name is William Adams. I'm currently at Microsoft, have been for about 20 years. And before that, I had a company of my own, but primarily I would say an internal Microsoft entrepreneur.
Thank you, William. And Kevin?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kevin Williams. I'm currently at LinkedIn in our sales readiness business for our LinkedIn Talent Services division. And I've been in the L&D space for about 15 years now.
Great, thank you all. So I will be watching the chat room as we go through this 25 minutes today. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there and I'll either pop them in the middle of the conversation, or we can have some time if they're a little bit off topic, we'll have time at the end to, I will make time at the end to fit them in. So just getting started. So Oliver, I thought we'd start with you, but Kevin and William, feel free to jump in. So regardless of the situation we're in right now with COVID, on-the-job learning has changed a lot over the last few years. What are innovative companies doing in this space?
Yeah, I think there's been a real push to make online learning effective. And of course, COVID just massively accelerated that. And what we're seeing, we work with a lot of companies on enablement of their sales team, which is sort of where we focus as a company. What we're seeing is people doing a lot of non-traditional ways of learning. So if you think about the standard learning, you sat in a room and you had somebody like inundate you with PowerPoint slides for 22 hours until your eyes were just like propping up with toothpicks. And so what people are doing is they're making the learning much more participatory. They're doing lots of breakout sessions. They're making it really engaging. They're making people actually give pitches. They're making them do activities constantly because instead of just listening passively, there's tons of cognitive research showing that the way you learn is by actually repeating the knowledge and repeating the use of the knowledge constantly. So there's notions like spaced repetition. And so really, I think the best learning experiences are highly participatory with a very, very minimum amount of just sitting there passively listening.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. There's even before COVID, before we all remote, that's a good rule, right? 70% doing, 20%, listening, or whatever the formula is, 70, 20, 10, pick your favorite formula. I think for us at Microsoft, at least, we're focused on learning how to do that online, basically, and trying to resist our desire to just say, well, look, there's all those resources online, just go do it and you're done. It's like, yeah, but what about the community aspect of it? That's what we're finding right now. 9 months into COVID or 8 months into COVID, it's like, yeah, all the resources are available, but the community aspect is missing. And that's what we're trying to focus on right now, is how to inject the community part of the learning, because that's important too.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to the great responses by Oliver and William is, we're trying to really think about how to make that seamless experience a bit more holistic. And on the back end, that might look like, assigning producer roles to, kind of carve up the responsibilities so that, this all seems interconnected and like a solid user journey experience.
So can you expand on what a producer role would be doing in this situation?
Literally, all the, for gamification, running your Kahoot games, someone separate should be responsible for that versus someone who's actually facilitating the time and in-person learnings. Just, you can imagine all the back-end logistics to kind of make that seamless experience go.
So rather than having it all set up ahead of time, like you might be able to do in an in-person training situation, this is something that has to be done ahead of time, or I'm sorry, during the class. Is that what you're saying?
Prepared for ahead of time, and both hands on the wheel during.
Got it.
Yeah, and we've been really putting a huge emphasis on games and activities. This is a time when people are sitting at home and they're a little stressed out, and the world everything seems kind of the same. So if you can break things up and make it fun and make it into a game, make it something where you're getting competitive, you're working with each other, maybe break it out into teams and the teams are competing, that kind of thing really makes it come alive.
So William, you had mentioned, building the community. I think we've touched on I think Oliver and Kevin have touched on that. But what do you mean by that? What are you doing in Microsoft to build that community during online learning?
Yeah, it's well, we did a kind of a study a few months back where we just talked to a bunch of people and asked them, what's missing. So it's the simple things like you could go in the kitchen, the water cooler conversation, the going out to coffee conversation, the lunchtime, the serendipitous discovery of people, subjects, whiteboards in the hallway where you can draw and stuff like that. So community is, in this context, an ability to gather a set of people relatively easily to learn something. Like, let's say I wanted to learn how to do, I don't know, a multi-threaded C# application. And we have subjects like that, specific classes that you can sign up for. And 6 or 7 other people can sign up and say, okay, let's form a crew. We'd call it a crew. Let's form a crew. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks on that subject matter. So we get a scheduled time of when we're going to meet, when we're going to go through exercises, and we have an ability to bring in experts. So experts can sign up to say, oh, I'm going to be a facilitator. I'm going to be available for office hours. So as they're going through the work, they can raise their hand essentially and tap me as an expert to say, hey, we've got questions on this subject. Can you help us, right? So you come together as a group to study something, in a crew setting for 2 or 3 weeks. And then after you've kind of completed that task, you might disband, right? You may or may not stay connected to those people for learning more and other things, or maybe you've just now found someone that you can have that virtual coffee with, right? So that's what we mean by community is just facilitating people's natural desire to come together to accomplish some learning objective, and then to easily disband and come together again for something else, right? That's what we're doing.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at like MOOCs, for example, and you look at the completion rate of courses online, it's some hideous number. I think it's low single-digit percentages of people actually complete classes that they start.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is that there's no social pressure to finish like there is if you're in a class, and there's no real consequences for not finishing. But another component is that you feel very isolated. And so finding ways to do exactly, what William was just saying, of finding ways to band groups together so that they feel like they're doing it together and they're kind of supporting each other, and you can ask the dumb question. You can always send mail to somebody and ask a question, but it feels like kind of a lot of overhead and you're sort of reluctant to do it. Whereas if you're in a casual engagement with someone you have a social relationship with, you'll just knock stuff back and forth. And a lot of learning comes from those less formal moments where you're just kicking things around together.
Yeah, I would add, I love, kind of the nomenclature William used. What we call that essentially kind of a cafe approach and a playground approach. And so the cafe approach would be, so your peer-to-peer learning, just exploratory. The playground approach would be, how you're doing some muscle development and really getting up to speed on certain behaviors. And so, sharing best practices and doing some teach backs.
So Bryn asked a question I think that is relevant to this. Are you finding a particular breakpoint that you break up the learning into? So how do you chunk a virtual meeting? And how long do you find that you can hold attention in Zoom before needing to switch into an activity or group?
Well, if you're talking about Zoom time specifically, the shorter the better is the basic answer, for me at least. And short by short, 2 hours would be too long as far as I'm concerned, where you're just constantly on camera. You need to be, as Oliver said earlier, you need to be into an exercise where you're actually exercising whatever you're learning. If you're learning, if you're lecturing, that's different. Then you're just, you're consuming. But if you're actually learning, you need to, here's the point, now here's the exercise. Here's the point, here's the exercise. So we try to keep things very short.
Yeah, one of the things they've done these, I like reading cognitive learning studies, and one of the things that they've shown, which is really interesting, is it's actually a huge contribution to your learning speed to try to answer the question before you know anything, which seems kind of counterintuitive, right? You should wait until you actually know something before you try to answer it. But it turns out actually you'll learn a lot better if you don't do that, if you challenge yourself with the test before you take the class. And so what we like to do is have a minimum of, people just talking, and you want to get into the part where the person's challenged to actually come up with the answer by their peers or by a TA or by, however you're organizing things constantly. And I mean, 2 hours is a long time to listen to Zoom. When we're doing, I like 2-hour meetings, but I like to have them 5 minutes of, and then like break out, and then come together again and have a little bit of lecture and then break out. Like I would spend most of your time breaking out and those small percentage of your time listening to somebody lecture.
Great. So William, sorry, let me send this one to Kevin first. So in this time of all this working from home and the lack of community, the water cooler talk, do you think that the learning, these sort of learning events are more or less important than they have been when everyone was in the office?
Well, I do think that they're more important. I mean, you've got less time, less share of minds, available, and people don't have the luxury of going in and being stimulated in as many ways in person. So, the pressure is on to kind of do this, not only knowledge transfer, but behavior change, here on a screen in very clever ways. So, that to me speaks to more important. I think that the point of, getting to the 2-hour mark, regardless of facilitator strength, people start getting googly eyed. And what we've realized is, we've constantly had to dial down the length of time and get to really get to a place where you're really understanding your audience and asking them what they want a bit, kind of your classic human-centered design kind of approach, and then figure out what's most scalable from there. And so that's the hard part.
I also think it's interesting to try doing the flipped classroom model. That for those of you who haven't heard that term, it basically means that you listen to lectures outside of class and you do homework inside of class. Was kind of the idea that came up in grammar school and other places. And so we try to do that where we'll assign the, course material you can read or listen to passively. And then when we get together, it's about engaging. It's about role play. Like I love role play. I'm a huge fan of role play. And what I'll do sometimes is like, I'll give the various people in the room a little script, and no one else gets to see your script. Only you get to read your script. And then everybody goes at it, right? So like sell this product to this person, or manager training. Okay, here's the direct, they're being really troublesome. And now you're the manager and you're trying to manage them. Okay, go. And like you can listen to PowerPoint slides about manager direct conversations all day long, but when you actually have to stare someone in the eye and like try to have that conversation with them, it is like a totally different experience.
That sounds great. I want to work there. Yeah, I think one of the key points is to going from, what do we say? From lecturing to learning, and learning is about behavioral change. And that's really what we're after, is behavioral change, right? I don't want to just feed you a bunch of information. You can do that on your own in various forms, but really it's behavioral change, and having humans around you, for what Oliver said, is about accountability, right? They help you with your self-accountability, and that's really what you want, because that's what's going to lead to behavioral change. That's what's going to lead you to actually picking up that new knowledge and being able to apply it and all that sort of stuff. So
Yeah, plus one to that point, William. I would say we're spending a lot of time thinking about the reinforcement, fast follow that comes right after, the anything in person, and then kind of what that means as you pull it across over the next 12 months. Obviously, we're in this pandemic longer than any of us thought we would be. So
and will be longer. I mean, for us, it's a very interesting. Sorry if I'm cutting into the next question, but we're back in February. We did a fundamental shift. I looked at or March. We were sent home, and I thought, okay, this is not going to be short term, because until there's a vaccine, none of us are going back to any offices because nothing has changed. And lo and behold, here it is. We've now announced that Microsoft's not going back till July at the earliest. So I took that as a sign of, all right, this is an opportunity to flip some assumptions. It's like, come on, it's 2020. Let's learn different, right? This is a great opportunity to really get at the nut. And we look at things like death by PowerPoint. It's like, let's stop doing that. It was an eye glaze when we were in the real, and it's even worse now. So let's stop doing that. If we really want to get to learning objectives, we have to do things different, right? And that's, I think, what we're all expressing now. It's like, yeah, forget that past. It was only 10 months ago. Forget all that. Let's really learn. Let's get to the essence of what really learning is, right?
So that actually is a good segue into what I wanted to, make sure that we fit in here. My CEO likes to quote very often, "Never waste a good crisis."
Yeah, exactly.
And so, what are the things that you all are learning and taking into what you're going to be doing after, what seems like 2 decades from now, after this is all over and we go back to some sense of normal? What is going to change? What have you learned during this time that you found to be more effective than what you were already doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple things for us. One is that I think that these online tools we have are incredibly powerful, but we are a very Seattle-centric company. We have almost everybody in one physical building, and we care a lot about that. And we're a very kind of, group huggy kind of culture. So I think we leaned on that, and we didn't really build the muscle of remote, of virtual, of online. And it wasn't a big focus for us. Traditionally, we focus so hard on online learning. And I think this was a really an opportunity to really hone our chops on how to do that. And so then hopefully soon, well, not so soon, but hopefully soon, it becomes an and. But I hope that we're able to go. I mean, I love the culture that we had of being close together and constantly getting together. I think that's a really powerful thing. But I also think you want both legs of that stool. Two legs isn't a great stool, but you get the point.
Kevin, how about you? What have you learned through this that you're going to apply moving forward?
Yeah, I would say it's my experience so far has been it's harder to go from in-person learning to virtual than virtual to pull that back to in-person, because we learned a lot about how to meet learners where they are, how to think about what's scalable, how to pull across and really expand that menu of what we can use to kind of stimulate and kind of make it more appropriate per the type of learning we want to kind of push out. And so I think when we go back into the office, we'll have a much more honed muscle, if you will, with regard to that.
William?
Yeah, I think there's reflecting the same, what Oliver and Kevin have said. But for me, it's I want to press the advantage. It's like, all right, the bloom is off the rose. Let's drive hard for this learning and remote and community-based and all these other things that we've now learned. I don't want to go back into the office. I don't want to go back into the classroom and lecture for an hour. I mean, it's like we've thrown that yoke off. Let's keep it off. Let's continue to see the value in this newer way of doing things. And then add physical as an augmentation, right? That's just like, well, why are we doing physical? Well, simply because we want to physically meet people. We want to socialize, but the learning is all this other stuff. right? That's how I view it.
Yeah, another thing that I think is really important to us is we've realized how much the social context affects how well people can learn. And so when you think about learning, you often focus on courses and training and all that stuff. But what we found is that for our new people, especially who couldn't lean on the social connections that we all have had for, being in each other's presence, we had to build this whole connective tissue of social engagement amongst people to do the best we could to supplement their experience and get it closer to what it used to be like of being in person. So what I would one cautionary note is in this online only time, don't forget that the social context is really key to learning as well as the pure learning moments.
Yep.
Yeah, I know. It's probably the same for a lot of people, but I have, I think, 8 employees now that I've never met. They were interviewed remotely. They started remotely. They went into the office for half a day to get their stuff, but I'm at home, and I may have seen them on a Zoom call, but that's it. It's very different, very different.
It's a strange new world.
Yes. So Margot Sutherland asks, how do you think about the complexity of the learning goal and the method of learning online or in person?
I can take that one, I suppose. We did that kind of this taxonomy of learning stuff from informational to actual learning. And we broke it down into like, okay, for this kind of thing is this. So informational, watch a video, read a PowerPoint, independent study, that sort of thing. The closer you get to actually learning and doing your, not 10,000 hours to expertise, but 20 hours to proficiency, we try to structure things in such a way that we can lead you towards proficiency. And as you get closer to trying to be proficient or expert, that's where you need to be able to pull in other people, right? That's where you need a group. When I'm doing informational, I don't really need a group, but as I'm trying to learn how to become proficient at C#, I need other people around me. I may physically need to be close to people if I'm constructing robots. I actually physically need to do it and pick up the wrench and crank the nut and all that sort of stuff. So just think of a continuum of things like that. They're kind of slightly different based on, what you're trying to learn, right? I know I'm just repeating the question by saying that, but you are essentially at least identifying that there is differences and then tailoring the learning experience to recognize those differences and not just assume, oh, if you're going to be proficient, PowerPoint is still the easiest way to go. It's like, no, you need the social construct to do the proficiency thing, right?
Yeah, the thing for Margot, the thing that we confront is that at the end of the day, the people coming in still have to do the same work that they had to do before. Like I manage the services team, and we launch enterprise, customers of various sizes all the way up to giant enterprises. That still has to happen. So we still have to teach people the same thing they used to learn. And so the challenge is, given that the context is different and some of the tools that we used to rely on aren't available to us anymore in person, huddling over things and asking your seatmate who's done it like 22 times already. So we had to figure out, okay, we have the same goal, we have the same problem, but now how do we break it up differently so that we still get people to the same level of proficiency using a different set of tools?
So I think I think all of you started to touch on this, but how do you scale learning, especially during a pandemic? What is different in order to scale it out to larger number of people? Kevin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that effectively, right? So, doing anything at scale requires, really understanding how each bit of technology is optimized and how it meets that learner where they are. And obviously, any instructional designer, curriculum developer worth their salt, they think about matching the modality directly with the proper learning objective, right? But kind of looking at that over time. And then once there's a point of view on, okay, what can be done at scale, then getting ahead of that with telling them what's going to come, what it will feel like, and just kind of, some of this is change management, right? But really kind of peppering the field, if you will, for letting them know how to utilize, these different bits. So that's probably pretty high level, but that's how we're thinking about it.
Yeah, and for us, one thing I would really caution people on is that I work with a lot of companies, a lot of customers who are doing sales enablement, which is basically training and teaching and getting people ready to sell. And consistently, the biggest mistake that I see people make when it comes to scale is not investing. It's expensive to teach people how to get good at a complex set of skills. And I think it's really important to lean into that and say, yes, we'll try to be efficient. Yes, we'll try to scale. Yes, we'll use fancy online tools. But at the end of the day, it's human engagement with humans where the best learning happens. And that is going to cost you. And so Christy asked the question, how do you justify that investment? And I would say, well, your people are your biggest expense for at least tech companies. They almost always are. And you're making this fierce, enormous, giant investment in your people through their salaries. And that represents latent capability in your organization. Now, if you don't invest in unlocking that latent capability, you are squandering that investment. Mm-hmm. You are not getting your money's worth. The amount you invest in enablement is trivial compared to the amount you invest in the people's salaries. And so if you can build an effective way of unlocking people's potential, that is the best ROI you will ever get in your life.
Yeah, and of course, the only thing I would add to that is, doing that case making around metrics that imply value and then extrapolating that's a great approach to take. Like, so for example, I'm in sales readiness. And so, we running a pilot, we basically said the impact on win rate and deal size from this pilot is X and Y. And if you extrapolate that, you might expect this. And that's how you can back into a justification for investment.
So that
yeah, in sales. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say that fits nicely with Christy's previous question. How do you measure learning and proficiency, right? So you're talking about you're measuring the effect of this. How do you do that?
That one's always tricky. And I think when you think about it, I think you should think about measure learning, measure proficiency, and measure impact, which aren't the same. They're related, of course. And in some disciplines, it's a lot easier to measure impact, like sales, because sales is the one discipline in most businesses that has a very crisp measurement of their result, dollars. Whereas if you're talking about like engineering, it's a lot harder to say what was the financial impact of this training class, on my engineering team. But so I think you have to look at a series of metrics. There's, did they take the class? Did they graduate? How did they rate the class? That's fine. That's useful, but that's not that interesting. What's really interesting is, did they learn anything? And if they learned anything, does that somehow make the company, ultimately, if you want to get really bottom line, any money? And so the extent to which you can actually measure that chain is very, very powerful. It's hard sometimes, but if you can think of how to do it, and I mean, that's something we spend a lot of time wrestling with, that is very powerful.
Yeah, and I would say that on that continuum in engineering, we would measure things like, how many bugs are you introducing? How long does it take you to get a new feature out without bugs? How long does it take you to respond to a live site issue? Is that improving? Are we getting better at that sort of thing? And there's also, even with the engineers, sentiment, right? And not just how did you like the training, but how do you feel about your job? Do you feel well equipped for your job? There's plenty of people right now who are like, no, I don't feel equipped for my job, right? And that's a learning problem. So there's lots of different ways that you can measure. And I think the trick is, as Oliver said, don't get stuck on the metrics of the class, because those are kind of, they're not irrelevant, but they're not as interesting, as he said, as to the proficiency or the end result, right? Yeah, don't get stuck on how many people took the class. 100, great, we're done. It's like, well, but did anyone learn anything? So that's the trick.
Yeah, quick point. The only thing that hasn't really been touched on yet, I'd like to kind of just highlight is the role of coaching. You know, that it's holy grail territory to talk about instilling a culture of coaching. And so how do you measure that? We spend a lot of time trying to think about how to identify, you know, how someone assesses on what they're competent at, you know, what behavior they feel good about, and then what their manager says. If there's a gap there, there's a reason for that gap. And that's another way you can measure, but in something that, you know, you can get a multiplier effect going with the culture of coaching.
Well, coaching is something you mentioned earlier, Kevin, and I actually wanted to pile on to what you said because I thought it was really important. What we see is that, and what learning, research shows is that it's repetition that matters, right? You got to keep doing the thing. What often happens is you'll take a class, you'll get all excited, then you kind of lose your mo, and then you kind of move on and you forget it all. And it's only by repetition that it becomes part of your behavior and changes the way you do your job. And the one key person who can make a huge impact on that is your manager. And it's by looking for it, inspecting it, holding you accountable for it, if that's appropriate, and coaching you on how to do it well. And so if you can find a way to track whether that kind of coaching activity is really happening, and in the sales world, there's products that actually, will allow you to listen in on the conversations and then give people feedback, and you can see whether that's happening. So you actually can get very crisp metrics on how much coaching is happening. That's super powerful.
Before we run out of time, because we only have about 4 minutes left, I wanted to get to Margot's other point. It's more of I think the start of a discussion than a question. Is she says, my sense is that online learning atomizes learning and causes the learner to have to do the arduous task of integration. What do you guys think of that?
That can certainly be true. I'll answer that with an example of one of the things that I participated in earlier. We had this idea to create what we called a designer's table. And it was essentially, the designer's table is modeled after, if you go to some restaurants, you can sit at the chef's table, and you're kind of right there in the kitchen, you see them doing their thing. So we had like weekly sessions where the designer, an experienced engineer, would sit with them and go through various topics, and you might have an overarching issue or challenge of, let's create a paint program, right? But we had to start with data structures and algorithms and language syntax and all the rest. And by the end, you have a paint program. I think you can deal with an integrated approach if you go into it with that, because otherwise, yes, if you just go in and teach a specific atomized thing, as she says, yeah, I could see you being left in the middle of the forest, right? It's like, well, I got this great tree, and now what? So yeah, if you teach forestry and then you see the context of the tree, then maybe it makes it a little bit better.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point that often online resources are like little recordings or little, things you read, and it's hard to string them together. I think the thing that helps people put it in context is actually putting it into action end to end. And so if, for example, if let's just do a sales conversation. Like you can read about, objection handling and challenger selling and like the product features and like all this stuff. But then it's looking someone in the eye and actually having to do the conversation end to end like you would in real life, that it integrates it all together. So I think the more you can make the experience during learning, the experience that you're trying to do offline or out of learning, and make it as realistic as possible and end to end, that's one way to fight that.
Hero stories and champions.
Yep.
All right.
It also goes towards Oliver's point of loving the role play, right?
Yeah. Role play brings it all together. Like all the atoms have to somehow get integrated into the conversation that you're having.
Perfect. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We are just about out of time.